Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're embarking on this really incredible journey. We're looking into the intellectual landscape of, well, an entire civilization, millennia of thought, and our guide, a truly monumental work, Surendranath Dasgupta's A History of Indian Philosophy, Volume 1. Now, when you hear Indian philosophy, maybe what comes to mind is, meditation, yoga, maybe spiritual gurus. And yeah, those are definitely threads in the tapestry. But our mission today, using Dasgupta's 1922 masterpiece, is to show you it's far, far more expansive than that. It's this rigorous, logical, really deeply sophisticated intellectual tradition, asking fundamental questions long, long ago.
Yeah, and what's, truly revolutionary about Dasgupta's work, especially writing over a century ago, is how it just fundamentally shifted how the world saw Indian thought. Before him, it often got kind of linked into the mystical category, right? Dismissed as maybe lacking the analytical backbone you see in Western philosophy. But Dasgupta, he meticulously laid out these detailed logical arguments, pulling them straight from the original Sanskrit texts. He showed this intellectual depth that, well, many in the West had either overlooked or just misunderstood. He wasn't just summarizing things. He was analyzing, comparing, elevating the whole field.
So he basically took what people saw as exotic, maybe mystical, and showed it was intellectually on par with, say, Greek or European traditions. That sounds like a massive task for 1922.
Precisely. It wasn't just translation work. He was actively demonstrating that Indian philosophy had its own robust systems. Logic, metaphysics, epistemology, it was all there. Think about it. Western scholars back then might have looked at ancient Indian texts, purely through a theological lens. Dasgupta, though, he highlighted the systematic reasoning, the debates, the different schools of thought that built on each other or argued against each other. His project was really like an intellectual bridge, proving that these fundamental human questions about self, reality, ethics, liberation, they're universal. And India explored them with incredible depth. He showed it wasn't just spiritual musings. These were carefully constructed philosophical arguments.
That's such a powerful way to reframe it. It really is like discovering this whole continent of like advanced intellectual thought that was just ignored or maybe misrepresented before. And this first volume alone, it covers a huge amount of time. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit more. This book, published in 1922, A History of Indian Philosophy, Volume 1, not just another book, you said it was a landmark. What made it so revolutionary right then in that specific historical moment?
Well, you have to remember the context. Early 20th century, right? Orientalism was still pretty prevalent in Western academia. It colored how Eastern cultures were viewed. Indian thought, when it was studied, often got filtered through this lens, emphasizing the spiritual, the exotic, sometimes, frankly, at the expense of its intellectual rigor. There was this kind of prevailing misconception, that it was mainly religious doctrine, that it lacked the systematic, analytical approach you'd find in, say, Kant or Aristotle. Dasgupta, with just incredibly diligent scholarship, he directly challenged that sort of patronizing view. He didn't just say Indian thought was sophisticated, he showed it. He meticulously dissected the Sanskrit texts, revealing these complex logical structures, the intricate debates about knowledge, the profound metaphysical systems.
Can you give us a concrete example? Like, how did he actually do that? What kind of argument did he present to put it on par with Western philosophy?
Okay, a good example is how he treated the Nyāya school. We'll talk more about the different schools later, but Nyāya is known for logic. Now, before Dasgupta, many Western scholars, if they even mention Nyāya, might just vaguely describe it as, a school of logic, kind of dismissive. But Dasgupta, he dug deep. He detailed its highly formalized system of inference, its categories of knowledge, its very precise rules for debate. And crucially, he drew explicit parallels to Western logical traditions. He highlighted how Nyāya's theory of valid inference, anumana, involved this sophisticated five-step syllogism. It rivaled Aristotelian logic in its own way, but developed completely independently. See? By doing that step by step, he wasn't just saying, hey, Indian philosophy is good too. He was showing how and why it was structurally and intellectually equivalent, maybe even more nuanced in some areas.
Wow. That sounds like an immense amount of work. He's not just cataloging ideas, he's actively dismantling these intellectual biases. And this first volume, covering nearly 2 millennia, how does he guide us through that vast landscape? It seems like it could easily become just an overwhelming jumble of names and ideas.
That's where his organizational brilliance really comes in. He structures the material masterfully, distinct logical sections. It lets you see this clear evolutionary arc, similar to how we might trace Western philosophy, pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic schools. You see the periods, the key thinkers. Dasgupta does the same for Indian thought. He shows this continuous, though very diverse, intellectual progression.
Okay, so for someone trying to get a handle on this vast history, what's the roadmap Dasgupta lays out in Volume 1? What are the main periods, the main traditions we encounter?
Right. He starts, logically, with the Vedic period. This is where the earliest philosophical questions aren't in separate treatises yet, but they're woven into the ancient hymns, the myths, the sacrificial rituals. It's like the fertile ground. Then he moves to the Upanishads. This is a really pivotal period, a major inward turn, shifting from focusing on outward rituals to deep, speculative questions about metaphysics, about self-realization. After that, we see the rise of heterodox traditions. These are the big challengers, most famously Buddhism and Jainism. They critique the existing Brahmanical orthodoxy, pushing thought in new directions. And finally, the volume really digs into the systematic development of the early orthodox schools, the Istika darshanas. This is where you get the formalized systems like Sāṃkhya, Yoga, Nyāya, Vaiśeṣika, Mīmāṃsā, and the early foundations of Vedānta. Dasgupta's genius is showing how these weren't just isolated schools. They were constantly in conversation and debate with each other, dynamically interacting.
That clear structure, that evolutionary path, sounds incredibly helpful. Like he built us a staircase through time so we don't get totally lost trying to grasp it all. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Let's dive into some of the actual ideas, the arguments Dasgupta illuminates. Where does philosophy in India really kick off, according to him?
Well, it doesn't start with abstract treatises as we might think of them. It starts much earlier, in the hymns of the Rigveda, maybe going back to 1500 BCE, perhaps even earlier. And what's just fascinating here, something Dasgupta really emphasizes, is how incredibly early these texts pose deep existential, even epistemological questions. He highlights the Nasadiya Sukta, the hymn of creation. It famously asks, where did this creation come from? Did it make itself? Was it created? Maybe even the gods don't know because they came later.
Whoa, that's astonishingly modern. That level of skepticism, questioning the origins of everything, even divine knowledge, thousands of years ago. It sounds less like religion and more like pure philosophical head-scratching.
Exactly. Dasgupta saw this hymn not just as beautiful poetry, but as a foundational act of philosophical questioning. It embodies this spirit of intellectual humility, this radical inquiry that he argues is really characteristic of Indian thought right from the start. And alongside this, you have the sacrificial rituals, the Nyāya, in the Vedic period. They weren't just, religious ceremonies. They were seen as cosmic operations. People believed they symbolically sustained the universe. It reflects this deep idea that human action and cosmic order are interconnected. Performing the ritual correctly was like interacting with the fabric of reality itself, kind of practical metaphysics.
So from these huge cosmic questions and this idea of ritual interconnectedness, what's the next big intellectual turn Dasgupta identified?
The next really profound shift, and Dasgupta gives it a lot of attention, is the period of the Upanishads, roughly composed between, say, 800 and 300 BCE. This era marks a dramatic pivot, from focusing on outward ritualism to deep introspection. Instead of asking, which ritual brings prosperity, the sages started asking totally different questions, like, what's the true nature of the self, the Atman? What is the ultimate reality, the grounds of everything, Brahman? And critically, how do you get liberated, achieve moksha from this cycle of suffering and rebirth?
And this is where that famous, almost mind-bending idea comes in, right? Atman is Brahman. The individual self is the same as the universal reality.
Precisely. And Dasgupta considers this one of the most profound, truly revolutionary concepts in all of human thought. It's not just theology. It's a radical ontological claim. It becomes the absolute cornerstone of Vedānta philosophy. It basically says your deepest self, your core consciousness, is identical to the universal ground of all existence. So liberation, moksha, isn't about going to some heaven or getting rewards. It's about realizing this fundamental unity you already have with the cosmos. Dasgupta really admired the Upanishads for how they blend this mystical intuition with rigorous rational speculation, forging this philosophy of non-dualism that still captivates people today. He details how different Upanishads use dialogues, metaphors like salt dissolving in water, or the famous dialogue between Uddalaka Aruni and his son Svethaketu to guide the seeker towards this realization, patiently, step by step.
It sounds like the Upanishads laid down this deep foundation, but as you mentioned, not everyone just accepted these Vedic and Upanishadic views. This is where the heterodox schools arrived and really shook things up, right?
Indeed. Around the 6th century BCE, you see the powerful emergence of Buddhism and Jainism, and they posed significant, very sophisticated challenges to the Brahmanical orthodoxy of the time. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, he famously rejected the authority of the Vedas, the whole emphasis on complex rituals, and crucially the idea of an eternal, unchanging self or soul. Instead, he proposed the Four Noble Truths. Life involves suffering. Suffering comes from craving. Suffering can end, and there's a path to end it, the Eightfold Path, which covers ethical conduct, mental discipline, wisdom.
And a key philosophical sticking point was his rejection of a permanent self, the anatta doctrine, which was a direct counter to the Upanishadic Eggman, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Buddhist anatta doctrine, no self, was a direct philosophical broadside against the Upanishadic concept of an eternal Atman. This idea that what we perceive as self is just a collection of constantly changing physical and mental bits, aggregates it led to incredibly intricate philosophical debates, both within early Buddhism itself and between Buddhists and the emerging orthodox Hindu schools. Dasgupta meticulously analyzes how this doctrine wasn't simplistic at all. It forced a profound rethinking of identity, continuity, what liberation even means if there's no permanent self. He might detail, say, the chariot analogy from the Milaññāpāññā, how a chariot is just its parts, not some separate essence applying that to the self.
And what about Jainism? It often gets mentioned alongside Buddhism as a major challenger. How did it fit into these debates?
Right, Jainism, founded by Mahavira, also emphasized ethics and liberation, but had its own very distinct metaphysical system. Its highest ethical principle is ahimsa, radical nonviolence towards all living beings, which had, huge implications for how followers live their lives. Philosophically, Jainism introduced Anekantavada. This is the idea of the many-sidedness of truth. Basically, reality is so complex that no single viewpoint can ever capture it fully. They use that famous analogy of the blind man and the elephant, right? Each feels a part, thinks it's the whole thing. Interestingly, Jain metaphysics proposed an eternal soul, a jiva, distinct from matter. This soul accumulates karmic particles through actions, which causes bondage. So philosophically, Jainism ends up in this fascinating middle ground. It accepts an eternal soul like the Upanishads, but its path to liberation emphasizes strict asceticism and purification, which is different from Vedānta's realization. And it's certainly distinct from the Buddhist no-self idea. Dasgupta really showcases how these intense debates forced all the traditions to sharpen their arguments, define their terms, and refine their whole philosophical systems.
So these heterodox movements weren't just alternative spiritual paths, they were intellectual powerhouses. Their critiques pushed the existing Hindu traditions to really clarify their own ideas and build more systematic frameworks. Sounds like a really fertile period for intellectual growth. And after those challenges from Buddhism and Jainism, the Hindu traditions did develop these even more sophisticated systematic responses. Tell us about some of these Astika darshanas, the orthodox schools that Dasgupta covers in such detail.
Exactly. These schools represent this systematic structuring of thought, often laid out in concise aphorisms called sutras, which then have extensive commentaries. Sāṃkhya is one of the earliest and incredibly influential. It proposes this radical dualism, a sharp distinction between Purusha, pure consciousness, the passive observer, and Prakriti, material nature, the active principle that includes everything from our bodies and minds to the physical universe. Dasgupta highlights how this stark separation offers a unique path to liberation. If you understand that your true self, Purusha, is totally distinct from Prakriti, you can free yourself from the entanglements of the material world. He shows how Sāṃkhya provided this powerful philosophical framework. It influenced yoga and even early Vedanta, but its dualistic vision is profoundly different from the non-dualism of the Upanishads. Then, building directly on Sāṃkhya's metaphysics, you have yoga, particularly as it's systematized in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Dasgupta emphasizes that yoga isn't just a philosophy here, it's a practical method. A system of disciplined practice aimed squarely at achieving that Sāṃkhya goal, discriminating Purusha from Prakriti. It lays out this eightfold path, ethics, postures, breath control, meditation, all designed to quiet the mind's fluctuations and help you realize your true conscious nature. He presents it as like a systematic approach to mental and spiritual engineering, not just vague spirituality.
I can definitely see the appeal of that practical side, both then and now. What about the schools that focused more on logic and the nature of reality itself?
Right. Nyāya focused intensely on logic and epistemology. It really became the bedrock for rigorous argumentation across many schools of Indian philosophy. Dasgupta dedicates significant space to its theory of knowledge, defining the four valid sources, or pramaidas: perception, pratyak, inference, anumana, comparison, upamana, and reliable testimony, yabda. He highlighted Nyāya's really elaborate system of syllogistic reasoning, showing its incredible formal rigor. It truly made Indian philosophy argument-driven, constantly scrutinizing how we know what we claim to know. Then there's Vaiśeṣika. This school developed a kind of ancient atomism and a highly systematic metaphysics. It proposed that the universe is ultimately composed of eternal, indivisible atoms, and it categorized everything knowable into a finite number of fundamental categories: substance, quality, action, generality, particularity, inherence. Dasgupta was clearly fascinated by how this, proto-scientific metaphysics, developed entirely independently, tried to explain the physical world and its basic constituents. It anticipates aspects of modern physics and chemistry in its drive to find the fundamental building blocks of reality.
Wow, ancient atomism, paralleling some Western ideas, but totally separate development. Amazing. And the last two you mentioned, Mīmāṃsā and Vedānta?
Mīmāṃsā focused primarily on the authority of the Vedas, particularly the ritualistic portions. Its main concern was understanding and performing one's duty, dharma, as prescribed in the Vedas. To do this, it developed an incredibly sophisticated philosophy of language and hermeneutics rules for interpreting scripture correctly. Dasgupta showed how Mīmāṃsā was crucial in defending Vedic orthodoxy against challenges, arguing for the eternal, infallible nature of Vedic commands. It's a deep dive into the philosophy of action, language, and interpretation. And finally, the early stages of Vedānta. The name literally means the end of the Vedas, or maybe the essence of the Vedas. This school is deeply rooted in the Upanishads, as we discussed, and it further develops those central concepts of Brahman and Atman. Dasgupta explored its crucial beginnings, setting the stage for how these ideas later branched out into various influential schools like Advaita, non-dualism, Vaiśeṣika, qualified non-dualism, and Vaita dualism, each offering different interpretations of that core Atman-Brahman relationship. He makes it clear Vedanta isn't just one thing, but a rich family of thought.
It's just incredible. Seeing this diversity, systematic logic, atomism, dualism, non-dualism, philosophy of language, all flourishing under this umbrella of Indian philosophy, each tackling fundamental questions in its own unique way, and as you said, often arguing with each other, it paints a picture of really intense intellectual vitality. So given this immense scope, this depth, how did Dasgupta actually pull it off? How did he compile such a detailed history? What was his method?
His methodology was, revolutionary for the time, and it holds up as incredibly rigorous even today. First, and most importantly, he relied heavily on the Sanskrit primary texts. He wasn't just reading summaries or translations by others, he went straight to the sources. The Yāgveda, the Brahmans, the Upanishads, the Buddhist Pali Canon, Jain scriptures, the original sutras, and the major commentaries of the orthodox schools. This direct engagement was key. It allowed him to present the arguments exactly as they were originally formulated, bypassing the common mistranslations or, frankly, cultural biases that had affected earlier Western scholarship. He was a truly gifted Sanskrit scholar, which was absolutely critical for this project. He also used a very sophisticated comparative approach. Dasgupta knew Western philosophy inside and out: Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Bergson, you name it. And he referenced them frequently, not just to show off, but to draw conceptual parallels, to highlight where Indian thought converged with or diverged from Western ideas. This made it much more accessible, intellectually resonant for a global academic audience.
For instance, he might compare Nyāya epistemology with British empiricism, or maybe Vedānta's non-dualism with certain strands of German idealism. This comparative lens was groundbreaking because it put Indian thought on an equal intellectual footing. It wasn't just some exotic curiosity anymore.
That deep dive into the original text combined with that comparative framework. Yeah, that sounds like the recipe for groundbreaking work. So looking back now, what are the lasting strengths of his work? And have any critiques emerged over the centuries since it came out?
Oh, the strengths are immense. Enduring, really. The academic rigor was just unprecedented for its time in this field. It set a whole new standard for how Indian philosophy should be studied, moving way beyond just classifying as theology or mysticism. Its comprehensiveness is staggering. Across that vast timeline, across multiple, often conflicting traditions. Remember, this is just volume 1 of a 5-volume project. It's unparalleled. And its cross-cultural relevance just can't be overstated. It fundamentally reshaped how Western readers, and importantly many Indian readers too, understood the depth and sophistication of their own intellectual heritage. It inspired generations of scholars worldwide. However, like any magnum opus that's a century old, it has some limitations, sure. The language can be quite dense. It definitely reflects that early 20th century academic style, which, can be a bit tough for readers today. Also, some modern scholars might suggest there's a bit of a bias towards the Vedic or Hindu Orthodox traditions in his emphasis, maybe giving less weight to some heterodox or later developments. That's a complex debate, though, and naturally, modern Indology research has continued. New texts have been found, new interpretations developed, so some of his specific historical conclusions have been refined or challenged. But honestly, these critiques don't really diminish its status. It remains a foundational text, a landmark. It's kind of like reading Darwin today. If you study evolution, you needed to understand the foundations, even if the science is advanced.
That's a great analogy. So even though it's a century old, it's still this indispensable guide for anyone serious about understanding the roots of Indian philosophy. So bringing it to our listener today, why should we care about this multi-volume history of Indian philosophy published way back then? What's its relevance now in our super fast-paced, information-overloaded world?
The contemporary relevance is actually profound, I think, when you connect it to the bigger picture. Look at the explosion of interest globally in things like yoga, meditation, mindfulness, non-duality. Dasgupta's work gives you the deep historical and philosophical roots of these practices. It helps you move beyond maybe superficial understandings to grasp the centuries of rigorous intellectual and experiential searching that shaped them. It helps you understand where ideas like karma or moksha actually came from, what they meant in their original philosophical context, which is often quite different from how they're used today.
And beyond the spiritual side, does it still speak to modern intellectual debates, maybe in science or psychology?
Absolutely. Think about the big philosophical debates we still have. Mind versus matter, the nature of consciousness, the idea of self versus no self, free will versus determinism. These aren't new. Dasgupta shows us how ancient Indian thinkers wrestled with these exact same questions, often proposing solutions or perspectives that still resonate with or challenge contemporary fields like psychology, cognitive science, even AI research. For instance, the Buddhist Ananda doctrine, no self. That offers a profound challenge to our everyday intuitive sense of having a permanent me inside something neuroscientists are still grappling with today. Or the Nyāya school's intense focus on logic and epistemology that still offers valuable insights into how we structure knowledge, how we make valid arguments. And, for people, particularly in India itself, it offers this powerful way to reconnect with the sheer depth of their own intellectual heritage. Moving beyond just cultural pride to a systematic appreciation of these massive philosophical contributions to humanity. It's a statement about the universal human drive for profound thought.
It really is amazing how ideas from thousands of years ago, when presented with that kind of scholarly rigor, can still light up our present and future, challenge our assumptions, expand our whole understanding of what it means to be human and to seek knowledge. And there you have it, our deep dive into Surendranath Dasgupta's A History of Indian Philosophy, Volume 1. What an incredible journey. Through that early skepticism, the radical ideas of self-realization, the building of rigorous logic, the challenges and evolution of these profound, enduring ideas.
Right. This book doesn't just list facts about Indian thought. It meticulously presents it as this living tradition, full of rational debate, metaphysical depth, and genuine spiritual insight. It's definitely a demanding read, no doubt, if you want to really get it, but incredibly rewarding for anyone who's genuinely curious enough to take that journey.
What stands out most to you from this exploration? Maybe that astonishing skepticism in the Nasatya Sukta, or that really radical non-dual idea of Man is Brahman. For me, I think it's the sheer audacity of the ancient Indian mind, tackling these fundamental questions with such system and rigor, and how those ancient debates about self, about the universe, still echo so strongly in our modern scientific and philosophical questions today.
Which maybe raises an important question for you, the listener, to ponder. In this world just saturated with information, how do these different cultural and historical traditions offer unique, truly invaluable pathways to understanding those fundamental human questions? Existence, knowledge, purpose. And maybe, what insights are we missing if we only ever look through one cultural or philosophical lens?
Thank you for joining us on this step dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep connecting those dots across the vast, amazing landscape of human thought.